Since diversity is reflected not just in who we are and where we come from, but how we learn, we are excited to welcome Lisa Nelson, the owner of Sea and Colors. Let's welcome Lisa. She will be listening and capturing today's speech with hand-drawn pictures and text. These visual images will help us remember what we learned, spark new ideas, and boost understanding. Please feel free to take pictures of her work and share with friends and colleagues online. Now I'm very honored to introduce one of TCF's trustees and former Secretary of Education under the Obama administration and President of Ed Trust. Secretary King is a powerful national voice for high-achieving, diverse, and equitable schools. He has worked in education as a teacher, as a principal, and at the highest levels of government, and through it all has maintained an extraordinary level of dedication, integrity, and continues to be a shining example of what a difference a few good teachers can make in a student's life. Please join me in welcoming Secretary John King.
Thank you so much, Mark. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. It's good to see many familiar faces and good friends in the room. Today is an important conversation because I want to suggest that this conversation that we're engaged in today is essential to defending and saving our democracy. That is what I believe is at stake in this conversation. When you think about what we have experienced over the last 2 years, I mean, think back to last summer as we watched the Nazis and KKK march across a college campus. Think about the conversations that many of us have had to have with our children about divisive political rhetoric, about racist language, about examples day after day of intolerance. Think about the degree to which we are constantly witnessing folks being victimized by hate, whether that is a travel ban directed at people of Muslim faith or police violence in our communities. Think about being inspired by young people who walk out of school to march on behalf of gun control, but then understand that they are forced to do that because we, the adults, have failed to keep them safe. Think about our fellow citizens in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, some of whom today still don't have power and water. Months, now 7 months since the hurricane. Still no power, still no water. Imagine if there was no power or water in Bethesda. Right, the National Guard would be there the next day to make it right, and yet we leave folks in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands without power and water. That is an abhorrent response to their suffering. So we think about the way in which we have to confront these daily incidents of hate and discrimination. We think about folks, African-American folks, who are just living their daily lives, going to Starbucks, taking a nap, going to the prom, and have the police called on them. Right, so we have to acknowledge that we are at this moment where our divisions have been made ever more present. But the difference we can make is in schools through the work that we are talking about today. Right, this is about the work of diversity, equity, and justice. Now, those are words that people often say but don't always live. But this work, the work on diversity in schools, is about ensuring that diversity equals justice, equals equity. Now, we know what is possible if we do this work right. I know it from my own experience in school. And those of you who know me, I know I was blessed to go to schools that were diverse by design. New York City public schools, where I had amazing New York City public school teachers who quite literally saved my life when my parents passed away. My mom passed when I was 8, my dad when I was 12. If not for the New York City teachers that I had, I wouldn't be standing here today. I wouldn't be alive today. But I had these amazing teachers who made school a place that was interesting, compelling, engaging, safe, and they did it in communities that were diverse, intentionally diverse. I had teachers who exposed me to this world beyond Canarsie, Brooklyn that I never otherwise would have seen. I was blessed to have teachers who could have said, here's an African-American Latino male student, family in crisis, going to New York City public school. What chance does he have? But they didn't. They chose to invest in me, to give me a sense of hope. We see the power of this work and the difference that it's making in the lives of students every day in schools reflected in this room. I think about the Morris Jeff Community School in New Orleans, a school that is standing up for diversity in the community, a school that has had its challenges in its launch, but understands the power of intentionally diverse communities. I think about the white parent at that school who pointed out that she could have sent her child to a different school with a gifted program serving more affluent kids, but made the decision to send her child to Morris Jeff because, and these are her words, we felt that until we were willing to take a leap on a new school that was helping to rebuild the neighborhood, we weren't ever going to see the changes that we wanted to see in the city as far as equity. Now, the success of this school is the success of my child. Right? That's what is possible. I see what's possible every day in my kids' experience in Montgomery County schools in Maryland. It's not perfect, but Montgomery County has a many decades-long commitment to integrated housing and integrated schools. And when I talk with my kids about their experience, what I hear from them is the experience of knowing kids whose lives are different from theirs. Different because of socioeconomic difference, different because of cultural difference, and they are benefiting. Their education is richer for that. We know from research that the Century Foundation has done that those kinds of experiences matter for kids' academic outcomes, and they matter for their development of socio-emotional skills as well. Kids who have the opportunity to go to diverse schools benefit in terms of academic performance, particularly low-income students and students of color, but they also learn the kinds of problem-solving skills, the kinds of analytic skills, the ability to take the perspective of others that makes a difference for success in college careers and as citizens. So this work is urgent, it is meaningful, but it is complicated, it is hard. And we have to be thoughtful about making sure that as we do this hard work, that we take on not only the issue of diversity at the doorway, but diversity in the hallway. And that's why I'm excited to be the speaker before this panel that you're going to hear from, because these are challenging questions. In too many places, kids' experience in school is still segregated even if their school is not. So we have a heavy lift to make sure that our schools reflect at the doorway the diversity we value. But what we have, I would argue, an even heavier lift to make sure that we then have experiences in school that support students' diverse needs. We've written about this quite extensively at the Education Trust. I think about the issue of access to advanced coursework. We see this in the Civil Rights Data Collection survey, that African American and Latino students and low-income students are disproportionately likely to attend schools where you can't even take Algebra 2 or chemistry or physics. But the darker, more worrisome truth is even when those courses are available, oftentimes students of color and low-income students are underrepresented in those courses in their own school. We did a report on the missing AP and IB students at the Education Trust. We showed that there were hundreds of thousands of African American and Latino students who would be in AP classes if their school just had the same representation in AP classes as the racial demographics of the school as a whole. Right? In too many places, you walk down the hallway of the school and you see African American and Latino students on one side of the hall in the remedial class and white affluent students on the other side of the hall in the AP class. That is not equity. That is not justice. We see this problem around discipline. The Civil Rights Data Collection, again, the most recent one, reminded us of the challenge we face there. And you'll hear from Monique Morris later today, who's written so powerfully about this. But think about the fact that African American male students make up about 8% of the students in public schools, about a quarter of the students who are suspended from school. Think about the fact that African American and Latino students are more frequently referred to law enforcement for incidents that happen in school. Think about today or yesterday, there was an article about the civil rights data collection data on corporal punishment. State-sanctioned violence in schools, disproportionately used against students of color. Right, we have nearly 20 states that still allow corporal punishment in schools, still allow the adults who are supposed to take care of kids to hit them. Right? And disproportionately that impacts low-income students and students of color. If we want to get diversity, equity, and justice right, we have to change how we handle school discipline. We have to rethink school discipline. If we want to get diversity, equity, and justice right, we also have to think about who the adults are in schools. Majority of kids in the nation's public schools are kids of color, but only 18% of our teachers are teachers of color. Only 2% of our teachers are African American men. Right? Even though we have now extensive research, the Learning Policy Institute has a new paper that sort of catalogs the evidence that having access to teachers of color makes a difference for the long-term success of students of color. We know, for example, from a study that Johns Hopkins did, that having just one African-American teacher in elementary school means for low-income African-American students that they are more likely to graduate from high school. We know as well that African-American teachers are less likely to suspend African-American students and more likely to refer them for gifted and talented programs. But we also know that having diverse teachers matters for white students as well. It's important for white kids to see teachers and principals leading in their classrooms and schools. If we want kids to be prepared for a diverse society, we have to make sure that the adults they interact with reflect the diversity we value. That is a teacher recruitment problem, but it is also a teacher retention problem. We've written at the Education Trust about what I would call the invisible tax on teachers of color. Right? The expectation that the teacher of color on the staff will be responsible for all the diversity work. Hey, John, what are we doing for Black History Month this year? Right? Or often we hear from African American male teachers the expectation that they're going to handle the discipline in the school, or be the mentor for all the boys who are struggling. Or we hear from Latino teachers in a report we did earlier this year, the expectation to be the translator for all the families. Right now, it's not necessarily that folks don't want to take on those extra responsibilities, but often they're asked to do it without compensation and without recognition. We also know teachers of color are less likely to be assigned to teach the advanced courses. They're less likely to get leadership opportunities. That work is also the work of diversity, equity, and justice in schools. It's really about how we define ourselves as a community. There are voices in our country that are trying to persuade us to define ourselves in opposition to the other, whether the other is Muslim or LGBTQ or African American or Latino or an immigrant or undocumented. Right? There are forces that are trying to convince us to otherize our fellow human beings. We have to reject that, and where we reject that first is in schools, where we can create communities that are intentionally diverse, but also communities that are intentionally equitable and just places. I'm inspired by the examples in the report today. I'm inspired by examples of schools that are thinking about how do we create communities that are racially and socioeconomically diverse that deliver great academic outcomes for kids, as well as positive socio-emotional learning experiences. I'm inspired by the examples of schools that are dual language schools, creating opportunities for students to become bilingual, both those who speak English at home and those who speak a language other than English at home. I'm inspired by the examples of public Montessori schools that are intentionally creating spaces that tap into kids' curiosity, empower them to guide their own learning with the support of caring adults, and attract a diverse student population. I'm inspired by the examples of schools that integrate the arts thoughtfully and STEM thoughtfully to say that school has to be defined by more than just English and math, that we need to provide all kids a well-rounded education, and through that, we can help to draw a diverse student population. It's inspiring examples to see this in the charter sector and the district sector, and we've got to redouble our efforts. And sadly, we know that the federal government is not, at the moment, going to provide the kind of help that they should. When, in the Obama administration, we proposed a $120 million grant program called Stronger Together that would support school diversity efforts. We couldn't persuade Congress to fund it. I heard from members of Congress it was too expensive. Interesting, because this year they found quite a bit of money for tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans. Heard we couldn't afford the investment in diversity. We then created a grant program. Some in this room worked on this grant program. A $12 million grant program through some discretionary funds that would allow folks to do planning work to launch school diversity initiatives. And sadly, for my successor, it was one of her first acts was to cancel that grant program. Not to put the dollars towards something else, but to return the dollars to the Treasury. So it's clear that the federal government is not going to stand with us, but the folks in this room, together with states and districts and educators and parents, can be the difference, can create these opportunities. I asked a friend this morning who teaches at Boston Collegiate, one of the schools mentioned in the report, what's the best thing about working in a school, being a part of this school community that's so diverse? And she shared, I thought, something very powerful. She said, you know, to me, it's the opportunity for students to learn and do extracurricular activities with students different from their neighborhood friends. She gave the example of the kinds of diverse experiences that they have. She said, you know, Ramadan is starting, and some of our students will see their classmates leave the classroom for prayers. Others of our students will go to their first quinceañera because that it may not be their tradition, but they'll have that opportunity because of who their classmates are. And she said, and you know what? It's not just the kids who have those experiences, it's the parents too. Parents get to interact with a whole set of people they never otherwise would. That's what's possible. That is the hope of this work. This work is about defending our democracy. It is about ensuring that our young people are prepared for the diverse workplaces they will find themselves in, but more importantly, to build a diverse, pluralistic society where we respect the humanity of every individual. So when you watch the news, it is easy to get discouraged, and it is easy to take division as a given. I want to say this room is about rejecting that and saying division isn't a given. What is a given is that together we can advance the values of diversity, equity, and justice. That's what it means to be an educator. That is, I would argue, what it means to be an American, to stand up for those values, because that is who we are. Thanks for the opportunity to join you all today.
Well, thank you, Secretary King, for those tremendous remarks. Are we doing question answer or?
Oh, do you want to ask some questions?
Okay. So I thought I was coming up too early. So if you have a minute. Yeah?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So good.
Don't be shy.
We may have to cold call.
This one over here.
So I've always thought of diversity as a way of trying to, especially the socioeconomic, as a way to try to sort of equalize the distribution of resources that will lead to better outcomes for more students in terms of, you know, educational attainment and earnings and employment. But you're emphasizing in your talk learning the lessons of tolerance and respect for people that you didn't grow up with and are often seen as different, and therefore maybe we're a little suspicious of them. My question is there evidence that children who have been in diverse schools, meaningfully diverse, in the hallways as well as the school itself, are, when we ask them 10 or 20 years later, more tolerant. And we have studies of tolerance back to the 1950s and the Stauffer studies. Do we have anything recent that tells us that they are, in fact, more tolerant of people not like them, would send their kids, would intermarriage, all the classic questions?
Yeah, and I should let Rick add to this because he's spent a long time studying this. But I know, for example, that students who've gone to diverse schools are more likely to live in diverse communities, to live in diverse neighborhoods, which to me it suggests that there is a sort of readiness for a diverse context that students gain from going to schools that are more diverse. I think there's also good evidence about sort of the ability to see the world from the perspective of others, which is more of a socio-emotional skill. But I think fundamental to tolerance is that sort of perspective-taking ability. Now, Rick, what would you add to that?
Yes, I think there's, there are 30, 40 years of social science research to back up what Secretary King is saying. In the past, we've tended to emphasize the NAEP scores and the achievement gains that are associated with school diversity because that was the coin of the realm at the time. But now, as Secretary King said, it's as important to strengthen our democracy. We're much more vulnerable than we realized, and so I think it's appropriate to that now the emphasis has shifted a bit, but there's very strong research to back it up.
You mentioned that only 2% of the teaching force were African-American men. Oh. You mentioned that only 2% of the teaching force are African-American men. What do we do to change that?
Yeah. Well, we did a report on teacher diversity when I was at the education department, and what we showed was that we have problems at every stage of the pipeline, right? African American and Latino students are less likely to graduate from high school. They are less likely to go on to college. They are less likely to major in education. They are less likely to graduate from college. They are less likely to enter the teaching profession. So we've got problems at every step along the way. A few things that I think are important. One is, what's the message we send to young people about the teaching profession? The young people who are in front of us in K-12 classrooms. Right? I raise the issue of corporal punishment or exclusionary discipline. If you respond to a 6-year-old getting in trouble, right, being over-exuberant about a science experiment by sending him home, not sure that is the way to send the message, you might want to be a future teacher. Right? It's quite the opposite, right? And so I think part of it is what's the tone we set in K-12 around what school is for kids, particularly for kids of color. 2, how do we start to create opportunities for kids, particularly in high school, but also in college, to work with younger students and to see teaching as something that could be a possibility for them, as meaningful for them. When I think back to my time as a principal, one of the things I'm most proud of, a kid who started our math peer tutoring program when I was a middle school principal, came back to the school to be a math teacher at the school in the very same classroom where she started that math peer tutoring program as a 6th grader. Right? So there's that sort of grow your own approach, and we're seeing a number of communities around the country take that approach of trying to get high school students, college students into the pipeline. Then there is making it more financially affordable for folks to pursue teaching, which is a state policy question often, as well as a federal policy question. And then there's recruitment, and we know that there are many districts. There's actually a study done not long ago on a large district in Virginia suggesting that there were real issues of discrimination in the hiring process. And so making sure that the hiring process is intentional about recruiting a diverse faculty, but then we know attrition is higher for teachers of color. And so we've got to make sure that folks enter communities that are supportive. I think about the work of an organization called The Fellowship in Philadelphia, which last year brought together 700 African-American male teachers, the most African-American male teachers I've ever been in a room with. But it was inspiring, and what they are doing in Philadelphia is creating networks both to mentor young people into the teaching profession, but also a support network for current teachers so that they have mentors and colleagues as they pursue teaching. And we got to do more of that as well. Yes, sir.
Doesn't seem like there's, thank you, a lot of policy work from any level of government to actually build more diverse school environments. So I'm just curious how you think about the theory of change and whether you think the push is going to come from elected officials and proactive leadership on their part versus sort of demand from parents and other constituencies.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think we have to build the demand side pressure. We're clearly not going to get leadership from the federal level. I think there's a hesitation on the part of state and city county elected officials to take this on because there's always the specter of Boston busing fights over people, right? That's where people's minds go very quickly, and so you see this continued hesitation to take it on. Even so-called progressive elected officials who won't use the words integration or segregation, right? So we've got to do work, I think, as a community to build parent demand. What I'm hopeful about is that when you survey white millennial parents, they talk about diversity as something they want in their kids' learning experience. So I think that's encouraging. I think there is untapped demand. Now, part of it is the frame. I worry that if the frame on school diversity work is, I want you to send your kid to a school that is worse by whatever criteria matter to you, because that will be more just for society. While that may seem like a strong moral argument, I do not think it will be a successful strategy for recruiting parents. Instead, I think what we need to do, and we have John Britton here, who's a legendary hero of this work, but we have to do what I think Hartford has done very thoughtfully, which is to say, what is it that makes the school desirable for diverse parents that is good and something we want for all kids? That's why I think about dual language and public Montessori and arts focused and career and technical education in many parts of the country, including in many parts of New York, where I was state chief, is the most socioeconomically and racially diverse school setting available because it's drawing from across multiple districts. They're organized regionally, as they are in many states, CTE programs. So I think there's an opportunity to build programs that are so compelling and interesting and engaging that people choose them, and the diversity is a benefit of that choice, as opposed to trying to say to people, you should send your kid to the school just because it's the just thing. I see the stop sign, so I could talk with you all day. Thank you for what all of you do.